Welcome to my very first episode of Budget Standard Decks. My goal is to present some options for beginners and for anyone on a budget. The top competitive decks that I showcase in my weekly series for Standard every Saturday can have a ton of rares and mythics. The last one I did was Esper Control, and that had 39 rares and 4 mythics. But fear not, you do not need rares and mythics to climb the ladder and enjoy Magic the Gathering. So today I'll present 8 of my favorite budget decks, as well as some optional upgrades if you want to make the most competitive version. I'd also love to hear from you about what's your favorite budget deck, what you would like to add or change to make these lists more competitive. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll also be showcasing some new Wilds of Eldraine builds and updating these lists, so remember to hit like and subscribe for more Magic content. With that, let's get started. First up is Mono Blue Tempo. This is already a fully upgraded competitive list since it only runs 4 rares. It's the deck I point people towards the most when they tell me that they are new to Magic. With a tempo-based strategy, you're looking to disrupt your opponent's plays by using counterspells like Make Disappear and Essence Scatter. And then you've got a couple of really cards that are really good at pressuring your opponent early. So Delver of Secrets can flip into a 3/2 flyer on turn 2 if at the beginning of your upkeep you flip over an instant or sorcery. So you have a whole bunch of instances and sorceries that kind of help you set this up. Consider lets you surveil, so if it's not an instant or a sorcery, you can put it into your graveyard and then draw a card. You've got Fading Hope to disrupt your opponent's plays, bouncing your opponent's creatures. Slip Out the Back, which is very useful for protecting your few creatures that you do have from your opponent's removal. And then Spell Pierce as well, if they have a small amount of mana available. You have Impulse to help dig through your deck. And then you've got the one rare that I mentioned is Haughty Djinn. Haughty Djinn is a specific rare, and it only sees play in this Mono Blue Tempo deck. And there isn't a budget replacement since Djinn makes all of your spells cost 1 less to cast, and it can act as a finisher. This thing can get huge, especially from Thirst for Discovery, where you draw 3 cards and then discard 2, and you can discard spells from your hand too, especially if it lines up lethal for your Djinn. And then you also have Tolarian Terror, which costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. So you just want to cycle through your deck, get as many spells into the graveyard as you can, so that you can slam down this 5/5 Ward 2 creature for as cheap as like 1 mana. I showcased a list very similar to this back in January, and I'll post the links to the gameplay in the top right corner if you want to check out the final version before deciding on whether or not to spend your wild cards to upgrade. Next up is Mono White Humans. This budget list is entirely commons and uncommons, full of cheap creatures you're looking to go wide and kill your opponent before they get a chance to stabilize. Its key card is Coppercoat Vanguard and leverages human synergies. So Coppercoat Vanguard gives each other human you control +1/+0 and ward 1. Then you're aiming to just run a bunch of humans that synergize with it, such as like Chaplain of Alms, a 1/1 first strike ward with Disturb. Got a little bit of removal with Lay Down Arms, very cheap, very good at removing your opponent's creatures. The only downside is that they gain 3 life. Recruitment Officer helps you dig for additional cards in your deck, since the majority of your deck, the entirety of your deck, is 3 or less. Recruitment Officer is guaranteed, almost guaranteed to hit one of those cards to dig later in the game. Ambitious Farmhand helps smooth your mana so that you don't get screwed and stuck on 2 lands. Cathar Commando has been a really nice trick almost, where you can flash it in unexpectedly, and then you can also use it as a 3-cost disenchant. You've got Ossification, which is a very good way to remove your opponent's threats, including their planeswalkers. You got Rafine's Informant, which the connive mechanic, which I believe was from Streets of New Capenna, makes it so that when it comes into play in connives, you draw a card and then discard a card. And if you discard something other than a land, it gets +1/+1. so good for early pressure. Resistance Squad, if you have another human, you draw a card. One of the things that's really nice about this like low cost decks is you need a way to refill your hand, right? And so Resistance Squad comes down, and then hopefully you can draw it into an additional threat. And then similarly, Gavany Dawnguard is really good for digging for additional humans in your deck. So it's a 3/3 Ward 1, and then it has this day-night cycle. And every time that it becomes day, or it switches between day and night, you reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among the top 4 cards, so just like Recruitment Officer, and put it into your hand. The upgraded version has a fair amount of rares, 8 if I counted it correctly. The most common rare or rare that you will see in other deck lists is Skrelv Defector Might. So if you're upgrading a little bit at a time, I would craft Skrelv first. The other 7 are more specific to mono-white humans, but mono-white humans does have one of the top performing decks for climbing to Mythic. And it is centered around Hopeful Initiate and Recruitment Officer on 1. Hopeful Initiate's really nice because it builds. It can get up to being like a 3 or 3/4 creature. Skrelv is awesome for protecting your creatures from your opponent's removal. Being able to tap this, even with your mana completely tapped out, you can use Phyrexian mana where you pay 2 life instead to give a target you control hexproof so that it fizzles your opponent's spells. And then you've got good old Coppercoat Vanguard, Guardian of New Benalia, which is can be indestructible by discarding a card. Intrepid Adversary, which comes in if you pay 4, it gives all of your board +1/+1, and then is also a lifelink creature. And if you play it for 6, then it comes in and gives everything +2/+2. Still has a little bit of ossification to disrupt your opponent's like key cards. You want to be very careful with what you choose to use ossification on. Thalia is a top rare that disrupts your opponent's spells. So as long as your deck doesn't have many non-creature spells, you're going to see Thalia. Brutal Cathar is a really great way to remove your opponent's threats. If you hit like a token and exile it, it removes the token permanently. And then you've got Adeline, which creates a 1/1 creature token every time that you attack. So as long as you play this onto a board with a creature that can attack, you immediately get a 1/1 that's tapped and attacking, and it helps you get your human count up quite high. And then you have Knight Errant of Eos, which is a great way to dig. So if you convoke this with 3 creatures and then pay the remaining 2 mana, you can look at the top 6 cards of your library, reveal some of those 2 of those creature cards with mana value 3 or less, which is the entirety of your deck, and put them into your hand. And then you've got a Ganjo is a pretty safe craft. If you're in a white deck, you're going to run this because it's essentially a plains that also has the ability to channel and deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. And then it also has synergies with legendary creatures. So if you have a legendary creature like Thalia or Adeline in play, then it costs less to play and is a great way to surprise your opponent. And the channel ability isn't casting a spell, so your opponent can't counter this unless they have a card that counters abilities. Third, we have Mono Red Burn. This deck is looking to get damage in early with creatures and then finish off your opponent with spells. We're running In the Festivities, which is a really great sweeper if you end up against mono white or any of the go wide strategies. And we're really taking advantage of the fact that Kumano faces Kakazan is an uncommon. This is one of the stronger cards in the standard meta, and it's great for following it up the next turn with a 2-cost creature or buffing something like Swift Spear. Swift Spear is a 1/2 haste prowess, so it gets +1/+1 until end of turn whenever you cast a non-creature spell. And I really like putting the +1/+1 counter from Kumano on Phoenix Chick, because Phoenix Chick is one of those cards that if they remove it, which they're kind of incentivized to do because of the +1/+1 counter, when you attack with 3 or more creatures in a later turn, you can pay 2 to bring back Phoenix Chick, and it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. And we've got Play with Fire, which is great for disrupting your opponent's early blockers or for dealing the 2 damage directly to their face later in the game. If you do shoot the player, then you get to trigger a Scry, which can help you avoid drawing lands, because you kind of want to hit 3 lands and then just sit. You've got Voldaren Epicure, which is a 1/1 that pings for 1 when it comes into play, but importantly, it gives you a blood token, which again is used for getting rid of those pesky lands if you keep drawing them later in the game, so that you can continue to draw into your threats. Electrostatic Infantry is a pretty nice uncommon that has Trample. It's a 1/2, and every time that you cast an instant or a sorcery, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it, and so this thing can become absolutely huge if your opponent doesn't use removal. You got Lightning Strike, which once again you can use to remove your opponent's threats, or just deal the 3 damage directly to their face. Reckless Impulse is pretty nice for after you have played out your entire hand, you need to dig for additional threats, so you play Reckless Impulse later in the game and try to hit a Lightning Strike to finish them off for the last 3 points of damage. And then we've got Call in a Professional, which is an uncommon, and players can't gain life this turn, which can be very relevant if you're looking at like a Phyrexian Flesh Gorger or something like that, where they're going to gain life off of lifelink and get out of the reach of your spells. So keep that in mind. You can use this to fizzle their life gain, and then it also deals 3 damage directly to face. The upgraded version has at least 3 rares and a mythic. I might have miscounted that one, but they are all quite specific to mono red burn. I'm also currently exploring an alternative list that maybe I'll call like mono red aggro, that doesn't rely on mechanized warfare or Chandra or Squee. The full summary of the 50 games will be posted next Saturday, so I think the safest craft of the rares here is Feldon. But basically we've got the same thing. We've got in the Festivities, which gets amplified by mechanized warfare, deals an additional damage, so you can hit everything for 2 damage, including their planeswalkers and their face, for 1 damage if you have mechanized warfare in play, which is a very nice synergy. You still have the Kumano and Swift Spear, Phoenix Chick, Play with Fire, Epicure, a lot of the core of the budget deck. Then you've got Feldon, which is a great thing to follow up to the Kumano, because when Feldon is dealt damage, and so if you make it into a 3/3, it's going to at least exile 3 cards from the top of your library. And then you can, until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. So it gives you really good dig to find your threats. It also has the Lightning Strikes and the Reckless Impulses, but then we get some shift things a little bit later. We get some more late game threats. Squee is an absolutely just amazing recurring threat. If they do remove it, you can exile it. You can pay 4 and exile 4 cards from your graveyard to bring it back, and it also helps you with going wide. And then we've got Chandra, just a one of, and I believe, I'm not 100% on this, but I believe that everybody gets a free copy of Chandra, so you don't even need to craft this card. Or at least when I started playing, it was included in the starter lists. I think they just changed the starting decks, so that might not be true anymore. But anyway, she has the ability to help you get additional mana by adding 1 red and dealing 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. Then you can also use a +1 loyalty to exile the top card of your library and cast it if it's red, which it should be because you're mono red. And then if you happen to get into a really late game grindy situation, she can give you an emblem. Her ultimate exiles the top 5 cards of your library, and you can cast them. You get an emblem whenever you deal damage to a target. Then you can deal X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. So just additional reach on your spells. I've never made it actually to her ultimate. Usually the game is over by then. But still an interesting one to include. Mono Black Aggro takes advantage of low-cost creatures and the great interaction and removal that Black has to offer. So we've got Clay Revenant, which is a 1/2 for 1 that enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 3 to bring it back from the graveyard to your hand. So it makes excellent sacrifice fodder. We've got Cult Conscript, which similarly we have it enters the battlefield tapped. This time it's a 2/1, and you can activate 2 and bring it back from the graveyard to the battlefield. But you can only do this if a creature under your control has died that it's not a skeleton. Cut Down is one of the best black removal, and luckily it's at uncommon. And then we've got Okiba Reckoner Raid, just a nice saga for 1 that pressures your opponent quite well. So it pings for 2 and you gain 2 life, and then you get a 2/2 menace later in the game. We've got Ashnod's Harvester, which is, I think, a pretty good uncommon for pressuring your opponent. I did a full showcase of this where I explored Ashnod's Harvester when it first came out. And the nice thing about this is that it is a recurring threat as well, that you can tap 1 and a black to unearth it, which is where it gets haste from your graveyard for a turn, and then you exile it. So you only get to do it once. But whenever you attack with this Ashnod's Harvester, it removes a spell from your opponent's graveyard, or removes a card from your opponent's graveyard. So you can use Ashnod's Harvester, like if you're up against Mono Blue Tempo, you can use it to remove the spells that they need to make Jin and Tolarian Terror stronger. Dokuchi Silencer is a ninjutsu mechanic, which is if a blocker is unblocked, you can return that card to your hand and play this down instead. So you can sneak this guy in, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may discard a creature card. So like a perfect one to do is Cult Conscripts or Clay Revenant, right? Because they can come back into your hand. And if you do, you destroy target creature or planeswalker that the opponent controls, so a little bit more interaction. And Go for the Throat, also another top uncommon in almost every black deck out there. Go for the Throat is absolutely amazing. We've got Infernal Grasp, which is nice if you end up against a deck that is mostly artifacts, right? If you have like a Phyrexian Flesh Gorger or something like that, you can't target Go for the Throat and can't kill artifact creatures, so it's nice to have like a little bit of like a one-outer at least, right? And you can kind of tweak if you don't want to be running as many Go for the Throats, you can run more Infernal Grasps. And then we've got Knight of Dusk's Shadow, which is a 2/2 menace, and once again, like similar to the mono red list, right? Your opponents can't gain life is really important to have that sort of effect to prevent losing to life gain. And then it has the ability to also be a late game mana sink, which allows you to tap 1 and a black to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So you can do that multiple times and make this into a very large threat. And then we've got Felstinger, which I also explored when it first came out, which is a 3/2 Death Touch with Exploit. Exploit, when this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature that you have, like Clay Revenant or Cult Conscript. And if you do that, then you can make target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. And one of the fun things to do, one thing to keep in mind, is that you can hit your opponent with that. So if they're only at 2 life, remember that you can hit them for lethal, and getting the Felstinger lethal is a lot of fun. The upgraded version of Mono Black Aggro has a metric ton of rares and mythics. The good news is that many of them are in plenty of other decks. Shieldred the Apocalypse, which I'm sure you've heard about or you soon will, is pretty much in every black deck. A 4/5 for 4 with Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. So single-handedly a win condition. As long as if they don't have removal for Shieldred, you just slowly drain all of their life until you win the game. Absolutely busted. There's a couple of other mythics in here as well. So the Phyrexian Flesh Gorger and Gix Yawgmoth Praetor are both a little more specific, so I would really only craft them if you absolutely love the deck. As far as rares go, Tenacious Underdog, which is a 3/2 for 2, the Blitz ability allows you to keep coming back. So unlike Unearth, Blitz is recurring, and it draws you a card. The only downside is that it's a little expensive and you have to pay 2 life. And then you also have Graveyard Trespasser. These 2 rares specifically see a lot of play, so I would consider them to be very safe crafts. The rare lands, the like Mirix and Mishra's Foundry and Takonuma are also see a lot of play, so I would consider them safe crafts as well. The other rares, though, are a little bit more specific to the archetype. And so I would tread carefully if you have a limited number of wild cards. But Gix's command just single-handedly, it has so much flexibility, right? You can give something +2/+2 and lifelink if you're racing against like mono red. You can destroy each creature with power 2 or less if you're against mono white or blue, Azorius soldiers. You can also return 2 cards from your graveyard to your hand if it's a long, controlling, grindy matchup. And then it also works as an edict where each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control. So you get to choose 2 of the 4 options, but they're all great. And there's some fun synergies like Gix. Whenever your creature deals combat damage to an opponent, you may pay a life and then draw a card. If you have Shieldred in play, then you gain 2 life from drawing that card. Phyrexian Fleshgorger is just an absolute boss and super useful against the mono red decks because of the lifelink. We've got the Graveyard Trespasser has the Graveyard Hate that's really good against mono blue. And then we've got Misery's Shadow, which is specifically for the aggro deck. If a creature you control, if a creature an opponent controls would die, you exile it instead. Sometimes that is relevant. And then being able to tap 1 colorless to give like the shade ability of giving a +1/+1 until end of turn is a big threat for your opponent, right? And then we've got the cut down and the go for the throat, similar to the budget deck. And then Evolved Sleeper is another one that you'll see in a couple of different mono black builds, but a 1/1 that can turn into a late game threat as a mana sink. And then if you get it to its final form, you can use it to draw cards, which can be very, very handy if you're up against control. And then last but not least, a little bit of the Razorlash Transmigrant. It's a 3/1 that can't block for 2, but most importantly, you get to pay 4 and double pit black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And there's a bunch of multicolored decks in the meta that are going to be running way more than 4 non-basic lands. So this ability is most of the time just two black to bring it back as a 4/2, which is a very nice recurring threat that your opponent will have to try to exile. The lands, Mishra's Foundry and Mirix, are both really good against the control matchup. If they have board wipes that kill all of the creatures on the board, your lands are unaffected, so you can then use this later in the game. I would be careful about pressuring them with Mishra's Foundry, because if they do remove Mishra's Foundry, you're down a land. But it's useful in the grindy matchups. Same with Takenuma, being able to find Shieldred again has been very handy. This budget Selesnya Toxic build is entirely made from the Phyrexia All Will Be One set, except 1 land from Streets of New Capenna. So the advantage of this build is that Standard used to rotate every 2 years in September, but they recently changed it to be every 3 years. So these cards will be legal in the format for at least another 2 years, and this deck is looking to win either through getting your opponent to 10 poison counters or through direct damage. You have Crawling Chorus, which has Toxic. So Toxic 1, 2, 3 is how many poison counters it gives your opponent if it hits your opponent. And then when this thing dies, it also replaces itself with a 1/1 Toxic Might. So it's very annoying. It's very hard for your opponent to remove it unless they exile it. And the deck has a lot of good combat tricks and protection spells. One of that is both is Tyvar's Stand. You are able to give target creature you control +X/+X and hexproof and indestructible. So you can use it in a combat to give it indestructible so that it doesn't trade with your opponent's creatures, or you can use it in response to your opponent trying to use removal by giving something hexproof. Very handy indeed. We've got Duelist of Deep Faith, which is just a 2/2 Toxic 1 for 2, and then as long as it's your turn, it has First Strike, so it can be problematic for your opponent to block. We also have Jawbone Duelist, Double Strike Toxic 1, so if this one connects with your opponent, it will give them 2 toxic counters, and if you're able to increase its toxicity, it can give even more, but it's a nice thing with Tyvar's Stand to push an incredible amount of damage in 1 turn. We've got Infectious Bite. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, and each opponent gets a poison counter. So essentially this deals 2 damage. Each toxic counter, you have to get to your opponent to 10 toxic counters to win the game, 10 poison counters. So you can kind of treat each toxic as 2 damage on top of the damage that's already occurring, right? So being able to remove your opponent's threat and also uptick that poison counter gets you closer to that toxic victory. Slaughter Singer is kind of one of the key cards in the deck. It's a 2/2 Toxic 2, and whenever another creature you control with toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. We've got Annex Sentry, which is kind of like the Brutal Cathar from the mono white list. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value of 3 or less until Annex Sentry leaves the battlefield. So this is very useful for pushing through your early toxic damage of Jawbone Duelist or Crawling Chorus. So use this to get rid of one of your opponent's early blockers. We've got Charge of the Mites, which is better later in the game. You can deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control, or you can use it to go wide. So if your opponent only has 3 blockers and you attack with 5 attackers that all have toxic and they only have, they have 8 toxic counters, you can get that last bit of toxic damage in for lethal. Then we've got Flincing Raptor, which is a 2/2 flying toxic 1, and when it enters the battlefield, another target creature you control with toxic gets +1/+1 and gains flying. So very useful for pushing damage with your Crawling Chorus, or especially your Jawbone Duelist, right? It hits for 2 toxic and 4 damage if you follow it up with a Flincing Raptor. Viral Spawning is you create a 3/3 with toxic 1 for 3, and then Corrupted is a mechanic they brought in with Phyrexia All Will Be 1. Corrupted is if your opponent has at least 3 poison counters. Then you get to do additional things. So this one, it gets flashback, so you get 2 cards in 1 to continue to pressure your opponent. The upgraded version also has Skrelv, which, as I mentioned earlier, it sees a lot of play in the current competitive decks. The lands outside of the Seed Core are also pretty safe crafts. Soul Partition was a pretty common rare as well, but it was just sort of recently replaced during March of the Machine. We got a card called Invasion of Gobakon, which has the same effect, but also creates a battle that flips into an Anthem if you deal the 3 damage to it. So you might want to hold off on crafting Soul Partition. It still has the upside of casting as an instant, so you can cast it on their turn after they've drawn. So, time will tell whether or not decks use the Invasion of Gobakon or Soul Partition, but I've seen more and more leaning into the Invasion of Gobakon. And the other rares are pretty specific to the Selesnya standard deck, but I have found it to perform quite well on the latter. So we've got Venerated Rot Priest, which is a 1/2 toxic 1, but it has whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So if they use interaction to try to remove your stuff, they're going to do it at the price of getting 1 toxic counter. And then also, it doesn't have to be just your opponent's spells. You can also cast like Tyvar's Stand in response to give your creature hexproof, and then because it was targeted by 2 spells, they end up getting 2 toxic counters. A very wonderful synergy. Then we've got Crawling Chorus and Jawbone Duelist, Tyvar's Stand, stuff from the budget deck. We've got Skrelv's Hive, which is an enchantment for 2. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and you create a 1/1 Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with toxic. So this just it goes into that go wide with toxic strategy so that you can get in that last little bit of damage. And then it also has the Corrupted mechanic, where if they have the 3 poison counters or more, then your creatures you control with toxic have lifelink, and all of the creatures in your deck have toxic. So your entire deck gets lifelink, which can be really nice if you're up against like mono red. Then we've got Soul Partition and the Slaughter Singer and Annex Sentry, a 1/4 for 3. So we're still running the Annex Sentry from the budget deck, and then we've got the Bloated Contaminator, which is a 4/4 trample toxic 1 creature, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. And what proliferate does is you can give every counter that's on the in the game an additional counter if it's already there. So proliferate hits like Planeswalker loyalties, you can uptick that, poison counters on your opponent, +1/+1 counters on your creatures, etc. Right? So proliferate synergizes incredibly well with the toxic strategy of Selesnya. And then the rest of it is just mana fixing. Now we're going to get into some of the non-competitive decks that I keep around just when I want to have some variety to play. I don't have a competitive upgrade for these lists, but I find them quite enjoyable to play. Rakdos Anvil is a high synergy sacrifice deck that is looking to swarm the board with tokens from Oni-Coped Anvil, and you also get to chip away at their life, dealing 1 damage, and you gain 1 life every time that you do it. And then you can finish them off with a big Dragon Spark reactor. And it's a thing of memes, but once again, very fun to play. Whenever Dragon Spark Reactor or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a charge counter on Dragon Spark Reactor. So this thing can just grow over the course of the game into this just absolutely huge threat. And you have a fair amount of good dig in the deck with Experimental Synthesizer and Mishra's Research Desk. Both allow you to exile the top cards of your library and look for the threats that you need. You have Exuberant Fuseling, which is a 0/1 trample, but it gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it. And when another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put on an oil counter onto Exuberant Fuseling. So this thing can grow in size to be quite the lethal threat. Because even though, so with the Forge, what you do is you tap it, sacrifice an artifact, hopefully, usually like a 1/1 token, right? So this creates a 1/1 token that you can then use to sacrifice it. And even though the tokens don't exist in the graveyard, they still trigger going into the graveyard effects. So you can sacrifice your 1/1. If it's the first time you're doing this during your turn, you create another 1/1 that replaces it. You ping them for 1 damage, you gain 1 life, and then you trigger Fuseling's power. It grows by +1/+0, and then you get to also put another little thing on Dragon Spark Reactor. So like I said, very high synergy. You get Voltage Surge, which is a very decent removal. It allows you to deal 2 damage like a shock to a creature, but you can also sacrifice an artifact and deal 4 damage instead. You've got Go for the Throat if you end up against something like Shieldred. You know, this is one of the best answers to Shieldred because she's not an artifact. Got Reckoner's Bargain, which you gain life equal to the sacrificed permanent's mana value and draw 2 cards. So this is in here primarily for if you're against aggro or if you're against mono red burn. Being able to sacrifice and gain life can be very handy, and then the card draw is also very good. And then we've got Blood Tithe Harvester, which is one of the best uncommons in Standard. Rakdos midrange was a big thing for a long time, and Grixis midrange largely because of this card. And when it enters the battlefield, you create a blood token. You can use that blood token to cycle away lands that you've drawn later in the game if you're flooding out. And you can also tap this to give a creature -X/-X, where X is the twice the number of blood tokens that you control. And what's it's fun is that you can use that like blood token with Voltage Surge to sacrifice. You can use it as a way to start the Oni-Coped Anvil. There's a lot of really cool synergies in this deck, and it's it's a fun little cheap deck that I recommend checking out. Boros Heroic takes advantage that Kumano faces Kakazan is an uncommon. It's very prone, the archetype is very prone to being blown up by your opponent's interaction, and the 2 colors instead of just being mono red makes it a little bit more difficult on your mana base. So it's not a very competitive list, but buffing your own creatures while using cheap instances and sorceries to force through a bunch of damage can be a fun way to finish your daily quests. So we've got Homestead Courage, which is a sorcery, puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it gives it vigilance until end of turn, and you can flash this back. And these cheap things that target your creatures are going to synergize later. Lauren's Escape is kind of like Tyvar's Stand, where you can use it in response to protect one of your creatures. A very important card in this archetype, in my opinion, because if they do use interaction to remove your creatures, you don't really have a way to deal with that. So, I don't think you can really replace this with much. Ancestral's Anger is very much like Homestead Courage. It's a cheap card to target your creatures to get some of the synergies rolling. Target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in your graveyard, so they stack on top of each other. And what's really cool about this one is that you draw a card, so it helps you not run out of gas by playing all of these really cheap things. Kumano buffs all of your creatures, pings them for 1, and then becomes a 2/2 haste. Is an absolutely amazing uncommon, one of the best red uncommon cards in Standard. Then we've got Monastery Swiftspear, which is a 1/2 haste prowess that you'll recognize from the mono red build. Same with Play with Fire. Similarly, you can use this to remove early threats or to hit them in the face. And then we get Illuminator Virtuoso, which is a 1/1 double strike, and whenever it becomes the target of a spell you control, it connives. So connive is draw a card, discard a card, and if you want to discard something that isn't a land, because you want this thing to get bigger, and this is kind of like your most lethal threat. And you can discard things like Homestead Courage that have flashback that you can then cast from later in the game. Blazing Crescendo, target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn, and then you get to also use it to dig to additional threats. Really great for making Virtuoso into just an absolute ideal 20 damage to you in 1 turn. Electrostatic Infantry, similar to the mono red budget, is just a really good one if you're doing the kind of instant sorceries, because it can grow into an absolutely large threat. And we get Baird, Argivian Recruiter, which at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power greater than its power, create if the creature has power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So any of these that get buffed over time, the +1/+1, if you put a Homestead Courage on it, if you did the Ancestral Anger, even the Prowess triggers creating a 1/1 that you can then additionally use to go wide. And the last budget deck is Mono Green Stompy. I think there might be a competitive deck lurking in this archetype, but I haven't found one yet. The archetype really needs a way to protect its big creatures, so you don't just end up trading down to your opponent's removal. It's running Bushwhack, which is really useful for smoothing your early plays, because with this archetype, you're really looking to curve out. You're looking to make sure that you hit your land 2, land 3, land 4, land 5, so that you can do your 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop. And so cards like this are really nice for ensuring that you have the mana when you need it. And then later in the game, you can also use it so that your big beefy creature fights one of the opponent's creatures. So it plays as removal as well. And we've got Death Bonnet Sprout, which is a 1/1 at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. If there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, transform it into a 3/3. That then you can exile a card from a graveyard. And if a creature card was exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Death Bonnet Hulk. So what's nice about this is that once you flip it, you can use it to remove your opponent's graveyard. Like if you're up against Mono Blue, for example, you can remove their spells so that their Tolarian Terrors and their Djinn they just don't work the way they're supposed to. And the other thing too is that I see a lot of beginners who are hesitant about self-mill, or milling their cards from their graveyard from their deck into their graveyard. And I would just like to take a moment and say self-mill is a good thing. I can show you the math if you're really interested in it, but it doesn't actually change the chances of drawing a card. Because you might only draw that card because you milled to it. So unless you're actually milling through the entirety of your library, you're not decreasing the chances of finding a card. It's gonna suck when your best card in your deck ends up getting milled into the graveyard, but it could have just been on the bottom of your deck, right? And so one of the things that I just like to say to beginners specifically is don't be afraid of self-mill unless you find yourself going through your entire library and losing because of self-mill. Otherwise, it's a good thing and gives you additional information about what's still left in your deck to draw. Evolving Adaptive is a 0/0 for 1 that comes in with an oil counter on it. It gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it, and then it gets an additional oil counter and therefore an additional +1/+1 every time that you play a creature that has greater power or toughness. So once again, you're aiming to curve out. You play this on turn 1, you play something bigger on turn 2, it becomes a 2/2. You play something even bigger on 3, it becomes a 3/3. So it can become this huge threat for 1 mana. We've got Tyvar's Stand to protect against opponents' removal, as well as be a good combat trick or a good way to push damage. We've got Armored Scrap Gorger, which is a good way to ramp to our 4-cost threats, while also, whenever it becomes tapped, you get to exile a target card from a graveyard. So you can use this similarly to the evolved Death Bonnet Sprout, if you will, to hate on your opponent's graveyard. And then once you've done it 3 times, you get a 3/3, so it's relevant later in the game. You've got Canker Bloom, which is a 3/2, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate if you sacrifice it and pay 1. And there's not a whole lot of proliferate synergies in the deck specifically. If you do proliferate, you can hit Evolving Adaptive and increase the one of its +1/+1 counters, put an additional one on there. But there's no toxic counters or anything like that. So most of the time, this is just a 3/2 that can also remove a problematic artifact or problematic enchantment. We've got Yavimaya Iconoclast, which is a 3/2 for 2 with trample, or you can pay the kicker for 1 red, and it comes in as a 4/3, and if you do pay the kicker, then it has haste until end of turn. We've got Jewel Thief, which is a 3/3 for 3 vigilance trample, that when it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token, so you can play Jewel Thief, and then on turn 4, you can use that treasure token to play a 5-cost card. And so we're kind of between Scrap Gorger and Jewel Thief, and we're setting ourselves up to skip turn 4 and immediately start slamming down big, juicy 5-cost cards. First one is Blossom Prancer, which is 3 double pip green for a 4/4 reach. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card or enchantment from among them and put it into your hand. So similarly, once we get there, we just want to continue digging through our deck to find big threats, right? And if you didn't, or if you're being really pressured by mono red, you can instead decide to gain 4 life. And then we've got Burly Breaker, which is a 6/5 for 3 double pip green with Ward 1, and it is a werewolf, so it has the day-night mechanic. If you or your opponent don't play any spells on your turn, it switches from day into night. And then if it switches into night, it becomes a big, beefy 8/7 Ward 3 creature. So I hope you enjoyed the episode on the standard budget decks. It's a little bit of a new format for me, so I was kind of tripping over my words a little bit, so hopefully I'll get a little bit better in the future. You'll find most of my up-and-coming content will be focused on limited or draft, where you build the deck from booster packs and then play against people with a 40-card deck. Since I'm a firm believer that it's the best way to reach set completion and collect a copy of every card, as long as you can do it well enough, because Arena rewards you for getting 4 or more wins out of best of. You only get 3 losses before you have to do it again. But I publish a weekly episode for Standard, so if Standard's your jam, remember to hit like and subscribe for more Magic content. It's also a free way to help me out and bring my content to new people. I really appreciate it. If you're new to the game or new to my community, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Discord or leave a comment below if you have any questions. I enjoy helping new people with the game that I have played and loved for over 25 years. So good luck with your games, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.